What would you be willing to give up right now to feel more awake and alive? This video begins with that provocative question, because the philosophy of less often starts with a single uncomfortable inquiry. Across centuries and continents, wise people taught that reducing wants can enlarge inner life and increase freedom from fear. Today, we live surrounded by constant offers to fill empty spaces. Yet, emptiness can be a deliberate canvas for meaning when treated with intention. In this episode, we will travel through history, psychology, and practical habit to explore how less can become more in life and why that paradox matters now more than ever. Simplicity is not an absence of richness, but a redefinition of value and attention. Philosophical traditions that praised simplicity were less interested in scarcity than in clarity about what truly mattered in life. When we strip away noise and distraction, the things that remain can reveal their deeper purpose and beauty in ways they could not before. This scene will begin by visiting the ancient sources that taught these lessons and by asking why they still matter today. Stoicism taught that inner freedom depends on distinguishing desires from needs and controlling the ones that control you. Marcus Aurelius and Seneca recommended a life of modest possessions and disciplined attention so that judgment could remain clear and action purposeful. Stoic exercises included voluntary discomfort and mental rehearsals of loss so that attachment would loosen and courage would increase over time. Their advice is not ascetic cruelty, but a practical framework for responding with composure when the world inevitably shifts and takes things away. Buddhist traditions traced simplicity to the relief of craving and the reduction of suffering that comes from ungrasping. The Buddha described life as unsatisfactory when clung to and recommended a middle way that avoided indulgence and painful deprivation alike. Meditation and mindful living were tools to see desires clearly and let them pass without building identity on them. This practice of deliberate reduction invites a gentle curiosity about what is necessary and what is merely an echo of habit. Taoist thinkers found simplicity in harmony with natural processes and in the art of effortless action called Wu Wei. For Laozi, the sage who acted least often achieved the most because restraint preserved resources and insight. The Taoist ideal discouraged exaggerated striving that carves the world into conflict, and instead favored a humble rhythm aligned with seasons and cycles. That perspective makes simplicity less moralistic and more ecological, revealing a connection between less consumption and sustainable flourishing. Religious orders across Christianity, Islam, and other faiths institutionalized simplicity as a pathway to spiritual clarity and communal solidarity. Monastic vows often included poverty, chastity, and obedience to create space for contemplation and service. These communities did not seek absence of goods for its own sake, but aimed to redistribute focus from ego to the common good. Studying these practices reveals how simplicity can be organized socially and how rituals can support a life of fewer attachments and greater shared purpose. Throughout history, simplicity often emerged as a response to chaos and excess, and it repeatedly returned during moments of crisis. When empires and markets expand, movements that celebrate reduction and restraint frequently arise to rebalance the human spirit. Those cycles remind us that simplicity is not a static doctrine, but a practice that adapts to cultural conditions and human anxieties. Understanding that dynamic helps explain why simplicity resonates today in the midst of technological abundance and emotional overload. Possessions can become burdens when they demand maintenance, attention, and emotional energy that distracts from living. The visible cost of goods hides a larger invisible cost in time, worry, and cognitive load that compounds over years. Owning less reduces the friction of decision-making and the anxiety of loss, and it returns hours and mental space that can be spent on relationships and creative projects. This scene examines the unseen ledger of ownership and shows why less can become a strategic investment in freedom. The relationship between simplicity and freedom is paradoxical because giving up things often multiplies the capacity to choose. By removing material anchors, we free ourselves from obligations to repair, replace, or protect those anchors at every turn. Financial simplicity, for example, can reduce the need for constant income and grant the freedom to pursue meaningful work over purely profitable labor. Here we explore how fewer liabilities can expand personal options and cultivate courage to take non-conventional paths. Minimalism in modern culture often looks like stark interiors and empty shelves, yet the philosophy beneath those images is deeper and more varied. Some modern minimalists emphasize aesthetics and design, while others stress ethical consumption and mental clarity. Minimalism as a philosophical practice is about intentionality rather than aesthetic mimicry, and it asks the question of whether each possession contributes to a life well lived. This distinction matters because it shifts minimalism from style to a discipline of continuous alignment. Finding contentment with less is not a single revelation, but a series of small recalibrations of desire and expectation. It involves noticing the habitual cravings that never satisfy and experimenting with alternative sources of meaning and delight. Simple practices like gratitude, deliberate spending, and slow routines reorient attention from accumulation toward presence and participation. This scene will narrate examples of individuals who discovered contentment through small shifts, illustrating how habits compound into character over time. There is a crucial difference between simplicity and deprivation that often gets misunderstood in public conversations. While deprivation removes possibility and imposes lack, simplicity invites choice and designs constraints that serve flourishing rather than punishment. Understanding this difference helps avoid austere extremes and instead craft a practice of reduction that preserves dignity and pleasure. This scene will explore examples of healthful constraint versus harmful scarcity and show how intention makes all the difference. Minimalism becomes philosophical when it turns into a method for reshaping desires instead of simply decluttering spaces. Philosophy asks us to examine assumptions and to test whether our wants are authentically ours or culturally inherited scripts. Practices like asking why 3 times before purchasing and creating time to want rules help reveal hidden motivations and interrupt consumer reflexes. In this section, we will present mental frameworks that make minimalism sustainable and intellectually grounded rather than merely fashionable. The psychology behind clutter shows that items act as emotional anchors and memory triggers, but they can also diffuse attention and increase stress levels. Research reveals that visual disorder taxes the brain and can reduce working memory and decision quality. Real simplicity addresses this cognitive burden by creating orderly environments that lower stress and invite creative thinking. This scene will explain the neuroscience of simplicity and present actionable insights that translate laboratory findings into daily life improvements. Designers and architects have long recognized that minimalism enhances clarity and function, but good design balances restraint with human comfort. The best minimalist spaces feel generous rather than cold because they prioritize light, texture, and careful proportion. Design thinking teaches that subtraction can be a creative act that reveals form and purpose. In this scene, we will look at design principles that translate philosophical minimalism into lived environments that are both beautiful and humane. Technology promises efficiency while often increasing hidden consumption and distraction, making digital minimalism a necessary counterpart to physical reduction. Notifications, endless feeds, and subscription services quietly accumulate commitments that function like possessions of attention. Digital minimalism asks us to curate our online lives with the same intentionality we use for physical goods, setting boundaries that protect attention and cultivate depth of focus. This segment will offer practical approaches to renegotiating your relationship with screens and apps to reclaim time and attention. Financial minimalism simplifies money by reducing recurring costs and aligning spending with values rather than impulses. Tracking monthly subscriptions and instituting periodic financial audits reveal where money silently leaks from a life over time. Saving intentionally and limiting liabilities can create optionality and strengthen resilience against shocks and stressors. In this scene, we will explore budgeting techniques and lifestyle choices that transform minimalism into financial freedom and personal security. Relationships thrive when presence replaces possession because people respond to attention more than to material tokens. Time given generously is the currency of intimacy and is more durable than any purchased gift. Minimalism encourages giving time and focused attention instead of objects that temporarily satisfy and later add to clutter. This scene will illustrate how prioritizing human connection over accumulation nurtures deeper bonds and more sustainable joy. Minimalism can also be political when consumption patterns aggregate into environmental consequences that affect everyone. Choosing less can reduce waste, carbon footprints, and the extraction-driven harms of global supply chains. Collective simplicity has systemic effects because scale down demand changes production incentives and can support regenerative economic models. This scene will map the ethical and environmental implications of less and show how personal choices connect to global systems. There are cultural traps surrounding simplicity that can turn it into virtue signaling or a form of aesthetic competition. When minimalism becomes an emblem of status, it loses its philosophical integrity and becomes another marketable identity. Authentic practice reframes simplicity as humility and service, rather than a curated display of restraint. This scene will investigate the social dynamics that can co-opt simplicity and offer ways to practice reduction without falling into performative traps. Practical steps toward a simpler life begin with small, reversible experiments that reduce risk and reveal preferences over time. Implementing a 30-day declutter, a one-in, one-out rule, or a shopping freeze can provide data about what matters and what does not. Rituals like weekly clearing sessions and seasonal reassessments keep habits alive and prevent relapse into accumulation. In this segment, we present a step-by-step roadmap for testing minimalism experimentally and sustainably in ordinary life. Another practical habit is to create thresholds for new possessions, like waiting a month before buying non-essential items to let desire evaporate. Those cooling-off periods reveal transient impulses and protect against purchases made to fill emotional gaps. Learning to ask whether an item supports meaningful projects or relationships prevents accumulation without purpose. This scene will offer scripts and mental models that help you interrogate purchases and make choices aligned with deeper goals. Minimalism also benefits from maintenance rituals that emphasize stewardship over abandonment, like repairing rather than replacing and organizing rather than ignoring. Repairing an object reconnects us to its history and reduces the appetite for constant replacement. Cultivating repair skills and learning to choose quality over novelty changes the entire logic of consumption toward durability and meaning. This scene will highlight repair practices and community repair networks that transform minimalism into a participatory craft. Minimalism is not an endpoint, but a continuing inquiry into what supports flourishing and what undermines it. Seasonality matters because needs and roles change over time, and simplicity requires periodic re-examination and adaptation. Embracing flexibility reduces the risk of rigid ideology and opens the practice to new phases of life and shifting responsibilities. This scene will encourage viewers to treat minimalism as an ongoing conversation with themselves rather than a once-and-done checklist. Case studies make philosophical points concrete, and listening to real people reveals how simplification reshaped priorities and well-being. Stories of families who downsized, creatives who traded clutter for studio space, and retirees who simplified to travel show diverse outcomes. These narratives demonstrate that minimalism is flexible and can be tailored to career, culture, and personality instead of being a rigid prescription for everyone. This scene will present a few vivid examples to illustrate how different forms of less produced more freedom and fulfillment. Critics claim minimalism can be privileged and inaccessible, and those critiques deserve careful attention and response. When people lack basic security, choosing less can feel like an imposition rather than a liberating option, and policy matters as much as personal discipline. Addressing those concerns means combining personal practice with broader social supports that make simplicity a feasible path for more people. This scene will engage with critiques thoughtfully and propose ways to make the practice inclusive and compassionate. Minimalism intersects with creativity because constraints often catalyze invention and focus, producing richer artistic and intellectual work. When resources are scarce, people learn to prioritize quality, improvise solutions, and notice subtleties previously obscured by abundance. Artists and entrepreneurs frequently report that constraints sharpen vision and force more meaningful choices. This scene will explore examples where less actually sparked creative breakthroughs and deeper engagement with craft. The global market pushes constant novelty, and resisting that pull requires both personal practices and cultural storytelling that values restraint. Media and advertising train people to feel incomplete and to seek wholeness through purchase, making counter-narratives necessary. Building cultural alternatives like repair cafes, library swaps, and shared tools can shift social norms and reduce isolated consumption. This scene will highlight community-scale practices that institutionalize simplicity and create visible alternatives to the cult of more. As we approach the end of this journey, remember that simplicity is not a rigid answer, but a direction for living with clarity and purpose. It is an invitation to trade the tyranny of more for the freedom to choose what truly matters. In that sense, simplicity becomes ethical, aesthetic, practical, and spiritual all at once, offering a pathway to resilience in an uncertain world. The final sections will synthesize practical steps and leave you with an idea to test tomorrow that might change your life incrementally and meaningfully. If you try one experiment after watching this video, make it the 30-day Time to Want challenge to see how your desires change over a month. Delay buys perspective and often reveals that fleeting wants were not worth the costs they asked us to accept. Document the process in a journal, notice the moments of discomfort, and celebrate the clarity that emerges as impulse weakens and values surface. This scene will guide you through the logistics and mindset for making such an experiment humane and enlightening. Minimalism, when practiced wisely, can help build a life where attention, relationships, and meaningful projects receive the majority of our resources. That redistribution often feels like abundance, because it concentrates value into fewer but deeper vessels. Philosophy teaches that good life is measured by depth, not by breadth. And minimalism operationalizes that idea in daily habit and social design. As we conclude, consider that less can be chosen not to punish desire, but to clarify it so that what remains becomes luminous. The philosophical twist is that simplicity reveals the contingency of our wants and the possibility of reorienting life toward flourishing. When desire is no longer the master, freedom grows and the world becomes an arena for chosen projects rather than reflexive consumption. This transformation asks courage because it requires saying no to many attractive things in order to say yes to a few exceptional ones. If this video gave you a new perspective on choosing less as a path to more, consider subscribing to keep exploring ideas that transform everyday life.